It's really a pleasure to be back, and to the fact that so many of you have chosen to come back. I don't know what to think about that. I think I should probably suggest that I wasn't particularly clear last time, and you're here to...
No, you were very clear last time, and that's the reason. We want to see how it followed up, everything followed up.
Okay. Well, then I think I will try to do that. What I thought I would do would be to take this kind of overblown proposition and try to actually make it real, because the circumstance of Detroit is just so incredibly complex and heartbreaking, and yet full of promise, that one foundation or many foundations attempt to try to have some leverage point in that place's trajectory is a pretty grandiose construct. And so when I was here last, 2 or 3 years ago, I tried to lay out for the group sort of the basic sort of foundational principles that we thought we would pursue, sort of how we would get started. And Ed and Joel said, you know, you ought to really come back and talk about whether you've been able to make any progress or whether this is, in fact, delusional, and that it was a good try to move on. And what I thought I would do, actually, apropos of what Joe said, is start a little bit with the changes at Kresge very quickly. I won't take much time. But those changes, then, I'm going to try to map onto how we're trying to work in Detroit. And then third, I'm going to talk about how we're working in Detroit has, or I think in many cases, begun to make a real difference. So let me start with Kresge when I arrived. That's the Kresge Foundation. Many of you have seen that slide before. But Kresge probably had as well-known a brand as anyone in philanthropy, in the sense that we did Capital Challenge Grant project. We essentially invented the Capital Challenge Grant 25 years ago. The rest of philanthropy and the rest of fundraising caught up with us. But for quite a long time, we were the only foundation in America that actually read bond documents for a new building project. And we did it well, and I think we had a beneficial effect on lots of places, helped people get to the end line. All of those things were true. But after my arrival, I suggested to the board that there was actually a broader way of thinking about the role of philanthropy that might involve greater risk-taking, greater leverage of resource, use of tools, trying to actually touch a value set that affects low-income people and affected the opportunity structures in America. And so we very quickly moved to something that looked like this. On the bottom line, you see the facilities capital as the center there. We essentially said, rather than just thinking about facilities capital, think about the capitalization structure of nonprofits. There are all sorts of ways in which you can influence the capital stability of nonprofits. And why don't we think about it? Everything from planning capital to post-campaign capital. And then as long as you're at it, why don't we sort of insert into that equation a set of values about what we would like to advance. I mean, we ought not to be agnostic about the kinds of institutions we're investing in. The very first grant I looked at when I came for my first board meeting was a grant from Harvard Medical School, which had an endowment about 6 times the size of Kresge, and I couldn't quite figure out why we were participating in that campaign, other than it was good work, and it was very good work. But it didn't make much sense in terms of sort of an animating set of core principles about the effect that we wanted our money to have. So if you injected that, if you injected sort of a sense of context, I mean, where is the medical establishment going? How are these different fields evolving? Does money in human services look like the same as money in the environment field? You then quickly move into this sort of second tier of work, which is to go sort of field by field in the fields in which we had worked and try to understand whether there wasn't some added value we could provide. And in turn, if you do increasingly work through capitalization strategies in particular fields, a way to sort of bring all of those fields together would be to work in a place. And because our home is Detroit, I suggested that that's what we would do. So the good news is that the board didn't really understand this and went ahead. And we began developing all of it. So that for the first couple of years, it was we moved from a very sort of technocratic way of working to a much more team-based way of working in which we constructed all of these things. But then we began to realize that what was true for the facilities capital was increasingly true of the foundation as a whole. So we weren't sure what this was adding up to. I mean, we had an education program, we had a services program, but was there something that sort of held the whole? And so just this last year, we looked at this. Sorry, now I explained to Ed. I explained to Ed is, think about this as a, yeah, audience going to get a crib sheet. I think that's a good idea. Think of these as sort of impressionistic paintings. You know, look at the, don't try to interpret the brush strokes. I'll try to walk us through a little bit.
This is in Rip's own hand, folks.
Yeah, but at any rate, yeah.
Taking it every step of the way.
So essentially what we did is began with the yellow swath, which is essentially our 6 program areas. Try to distill within each one of those program areas a large overarching objective, and you can read them on the page, with no more than 2 strategies within each. And when you actually looked at them, they arced up to the top, which was simply stated an attempt to try to improve the bedrock conditions of low-income people living in urban America. Very simple, not profound, but it began to provide the kind of food that we needed. But I tried to make the case to our board that it sort of begged the question of how we worked. Again, you can work on something, but conditions change, the externalities change, funding flows change. I mean, look at the Health Care Act. It's completely turned federal health care practice on its head, and will even more. And so the bottom set of pillars has to do with 5 qualities that I think increasingly influence and define how we work. Just very quickly, because I'm going to spend more time on this in just a moment. One was field leadership, the idea that you actually would try to move the field in a way that occasionally put you out front and that sort of put your sort of reputational equity on the line. The second was to work increasingly at the intersections of disciplines, that education and the environment and health and community development actually aren't as discrete as they would appear. They are all interrelated. It's very hard to imagine human services policies anywhere in America without thinking about the health surround, without thinking about the community development surround. The third is using a spectrum of tools, sort of working beyond grants, trying to work through our social investments practice, which has become not just program-related investments, which are philanthropic, below market loans, but a whole host of tools, loan guarantees, private bond placements, all sorts of ways of trying to make capital accessible to nonprofits that couldn't traditionally access it. Fourth was trying to make sure that you were engaging in risk, that you weren't taking the safe bet. Part of the problem with the old Kresge is that there was no bet whatsoever. We would actually add money to a campaign once it was done, and therefore there was no risk. We were actually safer than a bank. In 25 years, we had 2 grants returned, which is a pretty remarkable thing. And that's not so much a condemnation, but I just don't think it necessarily leverages sort of the risk-taking qualities that philanthropy can have. And finally, the fifth is to work closely with civic and philanthropic partners. I go through all of this because when we think about the Detroit circumstance, there's so many ways of sort of cutting and dicing where we are in Detroit and where we've been over these last couple of years, that I thought it would be useful to say, how does each one of these pillars, how does each one of these qualities come to work in Detroit? And what I want to do is take you through, I hope reasonably quickly, 5 distinct examples of where I think those qualities have landed in Detroit and what the results have been. So let me remind you about Detroit. Detroit used to be a town of 2 million people. It is now a town of 700,000 people. Yes. Oh, wow. I thought that was a question.
I didn't realize it had decreased that. Wow.
Yeah, and I won't belabor the Detroit story. You all know it. But the level of disinvestment in the community in which corporate actors, private sector actors moved out to the suburbs, displaced the capital from the core. The educational attainment levels are the lowest in America, lower than New Orleans, lower than Newark, lower than Oakland. The joblessness rate among African males between the ages of 20 and 40 is approximately 60%. It's a phenomenal circumstance, and it is nothing that anyone in their right mind would enter other than with sort of a profound appreciation for the complexity and the difficulty and the need to make incremental progress. This is not going to change overnight. And so what I'm about to walk you through, it has sort of a sense of incrementalism to it that I think it's the only way to make it in. I threw the physical map on the board just because, as we'll see later, there are huge swaths of Detroit that are just like their press. It looks like Dresden. If you look on the east side where that little word Gratiot appears, that's Gratiot Avenue, or when you look at the west side where the Grand River appears, you have levels of disinvestment, abandonment that are just staggering. We have approximately 90,000 abandoned homes in Detroit. The number of plants, the old Packard plant is sort of emblematic of the kind of disinvestment we've seen in Detroit. The land use challenge in Detroit is profound. It is simply too much land and too few people for which to really provide public services in any way that municipal government in America has done that. It's a stretch too far. And so I'll come back to a couple of the ways that we're trying to do it. So let me then suggest that this is where I think I left you last time. This was our 9 modules. So we selected 9 bodies of work in Detroit where we felt activity was in motion, there was real capital being deployed, there was leadership in place, and for which there was a real possibility that it could take root over the longer term. I won't scroll through all of them, but it ranges from a whole suite of activities around establishing and accelerating the green economy, to education reform, to arts and culture, to everything in between. What may be different since I was here last, I don't recall, are the pillars underneath that. Mayor Bing, Mayor of Detroit, when I showed him the drawing without the pillars, got a little bit exercised and said, well, how about public sector? This is all fine and good. These are all philanthropic initiatives. But what about what we do? And to his enormous credit, over the last number of years, they have really stuck to the basics. So trying to introduce a sense of stability and discipline into their finance system, right-sizing city government, trying to just generally improve the processes of public administration. All along the bottom are the real basic nuts and bolts things that this administration in Detroit is working with. And what I tried to suggest in this drawing is not particularly well suggested by the drawing, but it is that those foundational bodies of work coming out of city government have to be foundational. You have to have that stuff in place in order for any of this to hold. You can make bits and pieces of episodic progress, but over the long term, you just have to have a functioning public sector. So what I think has been difficult for the mayor is trying to figure out how those pillars then weave up above. So as you're thinking about your anchor institutions, your EDs, your MEDs, your major institutions, cultural institutions, or you're thinking about a new transit system, how does that weave then back into his attempts to guarantee public safety or stabilize critical neighborhoods and the like? But that is where we left off. So let me pick up by going through each of these 5 pillars and talking about how those 9 bodies of work are taking root. So the first one I'm going to talk about is this notion of working at the intersection of disciplines. The challenge here is that this is just, for those of you in philanthropy know better than anybody, this is just an unnatural act. It is just so easy to sort of focus on your education team or your environment team or your health team, but actually trying to understand where the adjacencies lie, where the overlaps lie, and what happens when these systems begin to push into one another. I mean, are there sort of third-tier possibilities that emerge? It's very difficult. One of the ways that I think this has been demonstrated is an organization called Living Cities that Hotting and Ed both participated in when they were in philanthropy. A couple of years ago decided to do something called the Integration Initiative. Up until then, Living Cities had essentially been a capital supplier to LISC, the Local Initiative Support Corporation, and to the Enterprise Foundation, 2 large community development organizations in the United States. About 3 years ago, the Living Cities team decided that they wanted to pick 4 or 5 places and try to figure out what this looks like. What would happen if Living Cities, with all of, and I should explain, Living Cities is a coalition of all of the national banks and most of the large national foundations, Gates, Ford, Rockefeller, MacArthur, Kresge, and others. And the power of that vehicle is to try to get the expertise and the flexibility of philanthropy together with the power of lending and the financial institutions that are at the table, and see if in that intersection you can drive a different sort of bargain. When we were doing that with LISC, we were just providing grants on one side and loans on the other side and hoping LISC and Enterprise would go and do good work. This was a real breakthrough in the sense that it said, let's pick places, even where the banks don't traditionally work, and have them try to fully integrate the loans, the grants, and all of the related activities. They picked 5 cities: Baltimore, Cleveland, Minneapolis, St. Paul, Newark, and Detroit. And Detroit became sort of the model for them, because this is what they found in Detroit. And again, this is where please don't worry about the brush strokes. It's way too complicated. But essentially, what this diagram suggests is the circumstance that living cities found when they landed in Detroit, which is along this central arterial, which is the gray in the middle. This is called Woodward Avenue. It runs about 4.5 miles from the river up into something called New Center, this sort of the midtown of Detroit. What they found was that the energy that I depicted on those diagrams, remember those 9 columns, was all working here in the core. Harder to discern that in the east in those big swaths of land, harder to discern that in the west, big swaths of land. But here you have a major urban serving university, 2 major health systems, cultural systems, housing developments, I mean a whole suite of issues. And what the Living Cities Integration Initiative has done, which is up on the right-hand corner, is to try to thread those things together, to try to understand what a geographically focused strategy of sort of disciplined integration looks like. And so we have moved about $23 million of bank loans into this space, including people who had never before lent in Detroit, Deutsche Bank, and a number of others, pooled their money for these 5 cities and actually said, even if this is not our service area, we're going to move money in there. And then we had the grant money coming from Ford and Kellogg and everybody else. And that was then coupled with the local philanthropic money that largely came from Kresge and a handful of others. And what you began to see was that how you invest in Wayne State or the Detroit Medical Center, which is our emergency hospital, or the Henry Ford Main Hospital up on the left, began to take root in a very different way, because all of a sudden you were asking about how are the practices of those institutions affecting the North End neighborhood. So we, out of this initiative, for example, developed a local work, hire, live program, which we provided incentives for the employees of those 3 institutions to actually live in the neighborhoods they serve. Almost 1,000 people in less than 2 years have moved into the neighborhood because of that incentive program. We similarly have developed a procurement program. When we began, we're purchasing about 3% of their goods and services from Detroit. It's now up to 7%. That doesn't seem like a lot, but on a big base of $2 or $3 billion of spending a year, it's a big number. And so you can actually begin seeing how the sort of the acupuncture point of living cities sort of landing here, trying to provide some seed money, has begun to sort of move some of these institutions in a very different way. The other example that sort of latched onto this was something that Harding was involved with when he was at the Knight Foundation, which was the, I'm trying to remember what it was called at Penn. It was a program, but anyway, it's called the Detroit Neighborhood Revitalization Fellows. We borrowed from Penn and then from New Orleans an approach that took about 30 mid-career professionals and in economic development and planning, gave them 2-year stipends to come and then placed them in community organizations working on these issues, and we centered it in Wayne State. So not only did you get 30 young professionals from all across the country, 10 were from Detroit, 10 were from other places who had once been in Detroit, and 10 were completely new to Detroit. You also began creating a cohort of community players who increasingly are acting as a network and adding huge musculature to city government and some of the key community-based development work that's depicted in this diagram. And so, very complicated, but over the course of less than 3 years, you can actually walk down Woodward Avenue now and see a very different circumstance. It is a profoundly different place with a different kind of critical mass, a different kind of synergy among the parts.
Has that reflected itself in a more vibrant urban culture, for-profit shops, bars, all that kind of stuff?
Yeah, it's a really good point. Absolutely, and I think that's probably the main difference you would see, is that along Woodward and along Cass Avenue, which runs immediately to the west, all of a sudden I think we've seen something like 37 new restaurants in the last 3 years. New, small, little boutique. Now, will they stick? Will they, there has been, and I'll talk in the next slide about another reason that is happening, but I think you're seeing very physical manifestations of some of these strategies coming home to bear. Whole Foods just announced 6 months ago they're moving onto the corridor. They're linking up with something called Eastern Market, which is the nation's largest public market. It's a full mile square, and it has urban gardens, it has retail, it has wholesale, it's a huge flower market on weekends, and so Whole Foods is actually taking an entire shed that we, Kresge, paid for the renovation of, and is going to run a food education set of classes out of that. And I think they just would not have been here 2 years ago. It's just simply there wasn't enough street traffic. I mean, people are out at night. At night, there are a whole set of bars that sort of were just hanging on the edge, and now with the sort of infusion of young people in particular, the bar scene, the sort of music scene, the techno scene has really taken on.
Was there a more serious crime problem here at night
Yes.
before all this occurred?
Yes,
And has
absolutely.
that been alleviated?
Yeah, I'm not sure it's alleviated. It's gone down dramatically. This is probably the safest place anywhere in southeastern Michigan to be at night. Go 2 miles to the east, go 2 miles to the west, it's a different proposition. But one of the advantages of this configuration is the Detroit Medical Center, Wayne State, and Henry Ford have pooled their police functions, security functions. And so they have a very aggressive sort of patrolling, and essentially you don't even see the Detroit police. It's the institutional police. Again, whether that's a model that can hold, how far you can stretch that out, those are all questions that I think are appropriate and we can talk about. But reinforcing this, I think, is the second piece, which is the sort of notion of philanthropic partnerships. The example I want to use came out of a really interesting circumstance about 5 years ago, in which Susan Beresford, who was then the president of the Ford Foundation, was about to get into a major legal fight with the Attorney General of the state of Michigan, a guy named Mike Cox. Cox was so annoyed that the Ford Foundation had moved to New York and had essentially, in his view, sort of turned its back on Michigan. And he was prepared to bring suit and force them to reinvest in Michigan in a big way. And we all thought this was ludicrous. The problem was he's going to bring it in Michigan probate court. He would have won. He might have gotten appealed up, but it was going to be really...
It was Michigan Corporation. It's the Michigan Corporation.
There's probably a few things in there which suggested they were supposed to stay with it.
Exactly.
I mean, as usual, forget what the donor intended.
Exactly.
Well, they didn't express the intent.
Let's
So as a result, Susan, who being the brilliant person that she is, said, in addition to sort of doling out little grants to the Henry Ford Hospital or to other things that the Ford family really believes in, why don't we make such a major play that it will suggest to everybody that we are rooted here for the long term? And so she said, so let's create a new intermediary dedicated to the recalibration of the Southeast Michigan economy. And she said, so we'll put $25 million on the table if we are not the highest contributor. So she looked at me, and she looked at Sterling Spearn and Kellogg, and so we all put $25 million on the table, and then got 7 other foundations and created a fund in excess of $100 million called the New Economy Fund. For the first year or so, the New Economy Initiative was scattershot, and I think there was every possibility that the enormous possibilities of the sort of collective action were going to be lost. And so I did this drawing for them sort of a couple years ago, and again, impossible to decipher, I apologize, but the spirit of it, I'll get to. Yeah, this is the innovation cluster. And essentially, I don't mean to make it quite so personal, but our team suggested that we still had $70 million to commit, $70 million strategically committed could still make a difference. So why didn't we focus geographically on Detroit rather than the entire region, which is a big region, Ann Arbor, Lansing, too complicated. Focus on Detroit and try to figure out how you generate small business development. It could be high tech. If you go from the left of the drawing, you can see all of these research institutions, Michigan State, Wayne State, all sorts of people engaged in commercialization, patent transfers, and you can then see sort of a direct pipeline through the middle of this innovation cluster out to much more traditional pipelines of high-tech businesses. That has happened, and we've actually seen an enormous amount of activity sort of moving through the system with some of the seed money that you can see, $3 million to Wayne State, $700,000 to a First Step Fund, a bunch of stuff. But I think as importantly, and perhaps even more importantly, there were two other plays that the innovation cluster made that are really beginning, I think, to help explain what you just asked about, Joel. One is community-based businesses also need startup money. It's different kind of startup money from the classic sort of venture money that flows into high-tech work. But it's the Midtown Anchors work. We had a whole series of small neighborhood-based institutions that wanted to do window washing for the Henry Ford Hospital, that wanted to do the green laundry coming out of the Cleveland model. I mean, all sorts of ideas. They had no way to get up and going. And so we, with Kaufman, we put a bunch of money into Kaufman, and they came in and created a sort of a technical assistance early intervention program that has helped us generate a whole set of very interesting community-based small business startups. We also created something called the Thrive program, which actually takes this sort of SWAT team and goes out into the community and tries to deal with people who are working on good ideas in their garage, classic stereotypic kinds of situations that actually exist. People in sort of the maker-hacker community that were just trying new stuff. And out of this has been this sort of remarkable birth of small business energy in Detroit. And because just yesterday, the two guys who were Zuckerberg's roommates went off to Silicon Valley, started a small internet startup of some kind. They've got, 30 employees. They've decided to move back to Detroit, where they're from. And we asked them why. And they said because there is this sort of enormous sort of young energy and this sort of pioneer spirit. I mean, this is not Silicon Valley. This is not Boston. This is not the Triangle. I mean, this is a place where there are sort of no rules, and it's sort of the wild, wild west. You can kind of do what you want. And if you have capital supporting this, and some infrastructure and back office support supporting this, it's a very interesting place to be. And then
the people who are the enterprise people, the locals, or are they people moving to Prague from the west? I mean, who are they?
Yeah, they're both. But I think in fairness, Harding, I think what we're seeing now is that the locals are starting up beauty shops, delis, that sort of thing. The folks who are coming from the outside are trying sort of next generation tech, energy, bunch of green energy work coming out of this. And those tend to be folks who either once were from Detroit and wanted to come back, or who just sort of see an opportunity here. And again, the challenge is it's one thing to get them here and get them started. The next challenge, and we just had a big meeting yesterday about sort of what's the next generation of this. So our $100 million is now all committed. What's next? What's the infrastructure to carry this work forward? How much of this has to be done through this NEI process? How much of it is sort of rooted in of itself? How much can we push off to Wayne State? How much can we push off to the Henry Ford Hospital? Those are sort of interesting questions. And finally, and then I'll move off. Sorry to take quite so long, but finally, the third play was just the physical space. What we found was that there was just a lot of need for just sort of black box space where these young folks, or not so young folks in some cases, could actually go get the kind of back office support they needed, get the kind of physical support they needed. And so we've actually put a lot of money into a physical space fund that sort of pushes both into something called Tech Town, which is actually a physical building with a couple hundred small businesses in it, as well as bunches of spaces, funky spaces all throughout the community.
Can I just ask a quick
Yes.
question? I think people would be curious, I certainly am, about who guides all this? There's so much happening, so much energy in the right spaces and places. The currency now is to talk about backbone organizations that keep everybody on target, get something accomplished. Well, that may be too cruel to push onto Detroit, but how do you keep it all together without flying apart?
That's a really good question. Well, let me tell you who it's not, and then we can maybe figure out who it is. It's not the public sector for the reasons I talked about. I mean, we now have an emergency finance manager in the city of Detroit. We are, a half step away from municipal bankruptcy, and so they really are sticking to their knitting. And to the credit of Mayor Bing, he really is trying to stabilize those pillars I talked about. It's not yet the private sector. There is no organized business presence in Detroit. There's a downtown partnership. There's something called Renaissance, but that sort of moved on to be a statewide policy organization, sort of classic lower taxes, lower regulation kind of organization. There is no intermediary, no nonprofit intermediary. And so what it has come down to is sort of, frankly, Kresge being in every one of those 9 modules. And Kresge sort of occasionally, not more than occasionally, periodically and regularly, getting people together across those 9 modules I talked about, and we just then sort of do an inventory. What are you hitting? What are the issues? Can we at least talk to one another if we can't fully coordinate? Who's doing what? Where might we need additional resources? And I think the reason that it's worked is that essentially Kresge can be sort of the Sherpa for outside organizations. The Ford Foundation doesn't know where to land in this matrix. I mean, they do kind of. But should they invest in the Midtown corridor? If all of those different systems going on, where is their optimal investment? We have that conversation, regularly. Ford and Kresge now have every quarter a 2 or 3 hour long sort of joint program session where we go off to New York or they come to Detroit and we just go through all of this work and say, where are you going? Where are we going? We do the same thing with Kellogg.
I'm going to say with Kellogg should be.
Yeah, we do the same thing with Kellogg. And we do the same thing with Living Cities, which has sort of an ongoing presence. So I think I don't mean this to sound overly self-centered, but I think some institution has to step up, and I think that's sort of what we've tried to do.
For those who don't know Rip, he has infinite patience for long meetings, talking over planning, and I mean this. I mean, it's just something that marked you off over and over again, beyond the conception, beyond the announcement. You will meet more damn times than anybody ever saw. And it's like, and
Maybe that's what it takes.
I'm saying but I mean, this is not some sort of thing
Sometimes.
he's throwing out there. It's the way
Yeah.
it operates.
But Rip, to follow up with that, how do you also keep the investment from the different players for the long term? Because things always take longer than you expect.
Yeah.
And so Ford has done it for a bit, but then will
Yep.
they come in and reinvest? Will Kellogg? Will
Yep.
all the other groups come? And how do you hold them to that?
That's actually, can I
Get back to
put
you
that?
later?
Yeah, because I think in many ways there is a sort of a structural answer. I mean, there's a sort of a metaphysical answer to that. Is as long as people are seeing progress and as long as they feel that they are in beneficial partnership with people who actually are getting things done, I think they will stick with the work. But I also think there's a structural piece. And unless you put the structural piece in place, and I'll end with that, I think you're absolutely right. It won't hold. Because, well, for all the reasons you can mention. So let me try to move more quickly so we can open it more fully to conversation. The third piece I want to talk about is risk. I think it's become a little bit of a cliche that philanthropy really is the sort of the social venture capital of community. But I think it is true. I think the key is taking risk that is commensurate with the magnitude of the challenge. I think we are very comfortable taking small risks. I think we are very uncomfortable taking big risks. And so probably the most outrageous thing we have done at Kresge falls into this domain. And some of you have heard this story, but a number of years ago, when I first came to Kresge, there was a guy named Roger Penske. You probably have seen Penske trucks.
Absolutely.
Penske is a wonderful human being, and he had helped the city of Detroit structure the Super Bowl so it wasn't an embarrassment. He's done a safe and clean program downtown that has really cleaned up the streets down there. He's a phenomenal guy. And he had just come off of all of this, and someone said, I should go to lunch with him, and so Penske said, so what should I do next? And I said, well, I've been in Detroit all of a week, but it sure seems to me that what you need is public transit. Hello. I mean, you've got Woodward, 10 lanes wide, complete public right-of-way. And no connection between your central business district, your cultural institutions, and all of your heads and mids. I mean, and you've got housing down here, and you've got nurses who would love to work up there, but have to live in Windsor. And he said, well, that's interesting. So we had a large conversation with a number of the key private companies in town, and Penske essentially said to me, are you prepared to do something about this? And we said, okay, we will put $35 million on the table for the construction of a light rail line along Woodward Avenue if the private sector will match it. And Penske said, we'll do that. He said, I will go out and get 13 stations named after the donors. We'll sell them for $3 million apiece. I know how to do leasing. I know trucks. I'll figure out how to lease your vehicles, and we'll get some bunch of new markets tax credits, and we'll be there. Well, that was 4 years ago. I think you already heard this part of the story. Okay, so the problem was that at the same time we thought, well, we had priced it out. All the engineering showed that it was actually quite simple sort of engineering task. You get no right-of-way problems, don't have to tear anything down, don't have to condemn anyone out. All the storefronts can stay exactly as they are, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. DT, our energy company, was going to donate the retooling of the electrical system. Well, it turns out the city of Detroit had a slightly different idea in mind, and Mayor Kilpatrick's mom, Congresswoman Kilpatrick, had been doing this planning exercise for the last couple of years to try to build light rail all the way to 8 Mile, all the way to the city limits. And remember, the map I showed you only took you up halfway, because if you go halfway up in a crazy, crazy system, you run into 2 different cities. One is Highland Park, one is Hamtramck. Those should have been annexed years ago, except there's a quirk in Michigan law that says you can't annex something that has separate borders from you. It has to be attached somehow in some crazy way, and by virtue of Hamtramck, anyway, we couldn't do it. So their whole scheme didn't work. I mean, and they didn't have any money to pay for it. And so we began a conversation with the city saying, all right, why don't we do a piece of this and we'll nest it into your broader system? They said, yes, 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 we'll do that. Until I opened the newspaper, and we thought we were making good progress. This is 2 or 3 years later. We opened the newspaper, and the governor and the Secretary of Transportation and the mayor of Detroit saying, oh, our mistake, we actually don't have the money to do this. We're going to do buses instead. Penske hadn't gotten a call, I hadn't gotten a call, no one had gotten a call. It was crazy. And so we, we then said, before we accede to the Secretary of Transportation, the governor, and the mayor, let's at least get them in a room and try to convince them that this ought to be done otherwise. So probably the smartest thing I ever did on this project was to hire Patton Boggs out of Washington. They have deep, deep expertise in transportation policy. A guy named Rodney Slater is the former Secretary of Transportation. And he said, okay, but if you have that meeting, you need your congressional delegation in the room because they're supportive. So we had a meeting I don't think Detroit's ever seen. We had Senator Levin, Senator Stabenow, their entire staff, all the congressional delegation, all their staff, Secretary of Transportation, FDA administrator, the governor, his whole staff, the mayor, his whole staff. And Rip. Yeah, and Rip, right? And Roger Penske. I don't think they knew who I was, but they knew who Roger Penske was. And a guy named Dan Gilbert, who runs Quicken Loans, who also has been a great advocate of this. And we essentially said, with all due respect, we understand that you don't have the money to do this. The city was going to issue bonds. Turns out they just didn't have the authority to issue bonds. Why didn't they tell us that 3 years ago? I don't know. They didn't. And they said, so if you, Governor, want to build a regional transit system through buses, great. Power to you. Bus rapid transit is a perfectly viable option. But let's build this piece, because you talk to anyone under the age of 30, and they're going to tell you that among their top 3 requirements for moving to a place, to your point, is public transit, and it's not buses. And maybe it should be, but it's not. It's got to be light rail, fixed rail, some kind of rail. And so he said, so give us 90 days to meet whatever requirements you might have, and we will show you that we can nest this system in this broader regional system. The governor was strangely quiet, and the mayor was strangely quiet, and Ray LaHood, who was a former congressman from the suburbs of Chicago, Republican congressman, leaned back, and he looked at Penske, who he really respected, and said, do you think you can do this, really? And Penske said, absolutely. He said, we will do this. And so LaHood and the FDA gave us 90 conditions that we had to meet. 90 conditions in 3 months. Part of it was financial. They thought that we didn't have enough money in contingency, all sorts of things. Part of it was engineering. They weren't convinced that we could go under the underpass and still do it with wires. And part of it was governance. They really thought that somehow we needed a regional transit authority to govern all this and handle it. So at any rate, I dedicated my top staff person to this full time for the better part of 3 months. Actually became 5 months. And last week, LaHood basically told his staff guy that we had done what he had asked. And so I think within the next 2 weeks, you're going to see an announcement from the secretary that this will actually go forward. It has been unbelievably complicated. I can't even tell you. I mean, why a foundation is doing this. I mean, my board was right to be skeptical. It wasn't the money. I mean, $35 million is still a big grant for Kresge, but it was the idea that we were essentially becoming an operating foundation, trying to deliver this project, and we're not going to run the system, and we're going to figure out how to make sure this is a public system, publicly funded, publicly regulated. But we had long meetings with the governor. They finally agreed to put $15 million into the project. We went back to the Ford Foundation. Ford has never invested in the public infrastructure project. They've given us $3 or $4 million. I mean, we've just tried to pull and prod, and Penske has gone into the corporate community and raised more money. But it's more than the money. We had to assemble. At one point, we had 36 professionals working on this: engineers, finance people, government specialists. I mean, all sorts of stuff. But I think the good news, and that's the little train coming out at the end there. For someone who can't draw, this is my favorite train. So there's a little train busting out. I wanted to have it say Kapow, but I couldn't fit it in. The next, and I'm almost done. The spectrum of tools question is, as I suggested earlier, another, I think, part of the answer to your question, Bill, because I want to use here an example that I think almost is never used, and that's the arts and the culture community in Detroit. If there is a single thing in addition to that sort of entrepreneurial culture that I talked about that has been more in the public press, international press actually, than anything, it has been the vibrancy of the arts and cultural community in Detroit. Because it really is this sort of wide open space where people can come and grab abandoned industrial properties, they can do landscape sculpture, they can, do anything. The problem was, a little bit like the entrepreneurial ecosystem, is that there was no real enduring support for arts and culture in Detroit, particularly with the withdrawal of the autos over the last decade. Their corporate giving programs had for so long essentially gone into the main institutions, the Detroit Institute of Art, the Detroit Symphony, the opera, some of the larger ones, that the ecology of medium-sized, small-size, and individual artists was beginning to wither in Detroit. And so one of the first things I thought we should do at Kresge when it came is to create a Kresge Arts in Detroit program in which we sort of tiered out not only support for major institutions, but operating support for mezzo-level organizations, grassroots-level organizations, and to create a set of supports for individual artists. So we created a fellowship program that's now in its 4th year, and we've reached almost 100 fellows. We give them $25,000 stipend, and they can do whatever they want with it. And so what has happened is that we've created this ecology with the top sort of inputs being specific to the kinds of organizations. So the big house is the large anchor institutions, all the ones I mentioned. The gardeners are the well-cultivated, sort of smaller, mid-level organizations. The greenhouse are the small little community budding organizations, of which there are a lot. And then the wilds are people who are just out doing wonderful and crazy and imaginative work. And so what we've tried to do here is to assemble a whole suite of tools to support this ecology. One is regranting. We provide neighborhood organizations with small grants that they then go turn around and do neighborhood beautification, youth involvement projects. It's a whole host of things, as you can imagine. The fellowships have gone largely into the wild space. These are often sort of emerging artists, and they're all individual artists. And we also make, I think, extensive use of sort of an aggressive communications campaign about the nature of the disciplines, and we're trying to place a lot of stories in both local and national press because it's had an effect. I mean, the story has gotten into the water system, and I think young people in particular from all over the country are coming back to Detroit. Of the last fellowship cohort of 20, back to Hadi's question, the last cohort of 20 artists, I think something like 16 had come to Detroit in the last 2 years. I mean, it's really exploded. Real estate investments, we've used loan capital, we've used direct grant to create not only sort of this sort of interesting potential black box space again for artists and small business creation coming out of the cultural community, but also actually an entire district in which we've reclaimed 6 or 7 major buildings right on the Midtown corridor that had become what's called the Sugarhill Arts District, anchored by a major gallery. The operating support I talked about. And then interestingly, and this is a whole other conversation, we've had to engage in some fairly high levels of emergency financial stabilization with the 2 majors. They were both undergoing huge pressure from the banks, and both were at risk of having to shut down.
This is the big house.
This is the big house, yes. This would be the this would be the Art Institute and the Symphony and the Opera. All 3 have restructured their debt through help from Philanthropy, also from other sources. And then down at the bottom, we've tried to use a set of tools that support the infrastructure as a whole. 2 very interesting festivals. One is ArtX, which features the 30 or 40 arts fellows coming out of the Kresge program, but we also have coming up Delusional festival, which lights up the entire Woodward corridor with neon artists from all over the world are coming in to sort of put neon in various shapes and sizes into abandoned buildings as well as other buildings. We've invested heavily in something called the Cultural Alliance, which is a consortium of 50 or 60 of these organizations from the Greenhouse and the Garden and the Big House, trying to figure out how we can become more efficient in supporting the back office operations of arts and cultural organizations. And we've been really fortunate to be able to work really closely with Rocco Landesman, who's the chair of the National Endowment for the Arts, who has a real passion for Detroit. He's visited 3 or 4 times, and we've worked with him to create something called Art Place, which again is a consortium of banks and foundations and the National Endowment to do place-based or creative grant making. How do you actually use arts and culture to help community development? And it's a neat initiative, and it's landed. He announced it in Detroit. And finally, and then I really will be done, is this whole notion of leadership. And here, and I'm hoping about it, this kind of gets a little bit back to your point. Here, the question is not so much field leadership as it is, what does leadership, philanthropic leadership, look like in Detroit above and beyond what we've just talked about? And I think it is trying to create sort of a table setting that will endure. How do you create a framework of overtime? We'll grab the interdisciplinary work out of Woodward. We'll grab the ecology of the arts, grab the entrepreneurship, grab the rail project, and make it a whole. How will that hold? And the only way to do that is to create a set of ideas and structures and mechanisms and funding sources around land use, because that is the cutting edge of Detroit. Detroit is doing all of this interesting stuff, but there are probably examples of really smart arts policy, really smart entrepreneurship policy anywhere in the country. If we can crack the code on the reimagination of Detroit's land, then I think we will have done something that no American city has done. Detroit is 139 square miles. That means nothing to me. But you can put San Francisco, Manhattan, Boston, and St. Paul in that boundary and still have room left over. And again, that's for 700,000 people, which is not even the size of Boston. I don't know what that's huge. Yeah, so the problem of how do you think about land not as a debit, but as an asset is key to the future of Detroit. And I think you do it through what I call a syncopation strategy. You try to understand where your strong beats are and you double down. That's why I led Joel with the corridor. There are other strong beats. There's the Eastern Market. There's a glorious riverfront test. There's a Mexican town that it really looks like Little Haiti. I mean, it's very vibrant, lots of small shops. But the point is, we need a whole suite of investments, and I tried to suggest that through what I just walked you through, that really play directly into those strengths, reinforce them, accelerate them, elevate them, whatever we need. The challenge is the weak beats, sort of in this syncopation strategy. What do you do with the weak beats? Because they are every bit as important as the strong beats. And so,
What's a weak beat?
a weak beat is an underutilized asset, you know. And so, about 3 years ago, I got a call when Mayor Bing just came into office from his planning director, a guy named Warren Palmer, who is a very good guy. And Warren said, the mayor really wants to do something about land use, so I want to go get this firm from Shanghai that did the Shanghai city plan, did the Buenos Aires city plan, and I want to bring them to New York, and I want to do that. Will you pay for that? And I said, no. Have you thought about how you might do this differently? I mean, in particularly New Orleans. I mean, this is not a town, nor is any town, somewhere where you just sort of plop a master plan down. And I said, plus Warren, when we had actually gone back on, we had 13 master plans done in the last 25 years in Detroit. I mean, that's not the problem. The problem is, how do you engage your community in that process? How do you sort of weave it into this sort of complexity of pre-existing conditions? I mean, all that kind of stuff. And he said, oh, all right, fine. So he said, will you give us 2 weeks, 4 weeks? And so we sent a team down to New Orleans. We talked to Gary Shea. We talked to everyone we could talk to. We used to work with Ed, who led the community engagement process in New Orleans, and came back with a white paper that basically said what you really need is sort of a 2-tier process. You absolutely need the best technical experts in the world trying to figure out what are your underlying conditions, how do you use your land, how do you use your water, how do you rejigger your transportation system, all that stuff, all that technical stuff has to be done. That has to be integrated with the community engagement process. You just have got to involve your community in the conversation about what they want their future to look like. And he said, that sounds great. Will you pay for that? And I said, yeah, that we will pay for. And so I got on a plane and met with a woman who was just finishing up with Cory Booker in Newark as her planning director, and who had developed the Anacostia plan in Washington, D.C. Her name is Toni Griffin, spectacular planner. And I said, would you be willing to come to Detroit? She had worked here in Detroit years ago, and said, yeah, I would. It's any planner's ultimate challenge. She said, but I need teams. I need these technical teams. So she went out and got technical teams of both Detroiters and national and international people to look at infrastructure, water, transport, all of the big systems that needed to be done, and to create the kind of the sophisticated sort of data platform that you needed to do all of this. And we began the process. So far, so good. But we then had a Detroit moment in which as we're making progress with this, the city said, oh, we really need to drive this much more than we have been driving it. This is such a political thing. It's so highly visible. We said, fine, take all the credit you want. We said, no. We need our people to actually be running this program. So Toni needs to move aside. Your technical teams need to move aside, and we need to move into that space. And we'll do the community engagement. We'll do the technical analysis. You just help us along. It was just a disaster. It was just awful.
I
Say why.
2 years ago you were here.
Yeah.
Talked
Oh,
about
God.
that. And you were in the middle of this total mess.
We lost that.
Say why, what made it a disaster? I mean, was it the politics of the situation? Was it the quality of the people involved in it as compared to the quality of the people involved when you were doing it? What really made the difference?
So one was pure politics. I don't think so much the mayor, who was a very decent guy, but I think the people around him said, this is essentially an insult to the city of Detroit. Here you have all of these high-level people who think they know how to do community engagement, they think they know how to do these technical analysis. We can do that. We are not incompetent here. And so,
And then they proved they were.
well, that's the second part of the answer. It's just that nobody is that competent. When you're dealing with issues of the kind of complexity you're dealing with in Detroit, everybody's on deck. And what we said to them was, absolutely. So you guys can be the front of the community. We get that. The mayor can hold press conferences every week if he wants. And that's great. And we will feed. We'll write the script. We'll feed you whatever you need. But I think the people around here were just so threatened by this, and they just pulled inward. And they would. I mean, Tony essentially became persona non grata. I mean, she literally is the finest urban planner in America, I would argue. And she just was completely marginalized. And so what we did after I was here last time is that we shut our part of the project down for 9 months. And we said to the mayor, because the mayor said, well, I need a bunch of short-term wins. And he was working with the Secretary of Housing to try to redirect HUD dollars so that he could get a bunch of short-term wins. He wanted to work in 3 neighborhoods, show that you could actually make progress in the 3 neighborhoods. And we said, fine, we'll feed you all of our analysis. We'll do whatever we can to make that possible. And so we said, you go do that. Go do that. Go do the short-term stuff, and let us sort of do this long-term stuff. But the long-term stuff had more to it because they couldn't even do the short-term stuff. So for 9 months, essentially, we kind of got in, pulled back, got in, pulled back, tried this, tried that, and it just didn't work. And finally, in January,
Is this January of this year?
This year. Because they had sort of been working away with bits and pieces, but they were just hitting these roadblocks. They were hitting these roadblocks. And we finally just said, let's shift the long-term planning process to an agency of government that is actually quite competent, which is our Detroit Economic Growth Corporation. They do all of our economic development. They have no planning capacity whatsoever. But we said to them, will you take this project and essentially sort of be the governance structure that permits us at least finish the technical analysis and design a different kind of community engagement process? It will be completely separate from the mayor, and we need you as sort of a legitimizer of the process. And that actually worked really well. And the mayor went off and tried to do his 3 neighborhoods. He's still trying to do his 3 neighborhoods 10 months later. And we now have finished the plan. And the plan, and again, too hard to decipher, has sort of 6 big components. Let me just quickly touch on them. One is just a set of strategies that promote distinct and competitive neighborhoods. This is everything you might expect. Housing stabilization, sort of neighborhoods of opportunity where clusters of services are attached to schools. I mean, all of the kinds of strategies you might imagine. Then there are a whole set of strategies around economic development focusing on the localized food economy, because there really is a huge food movement growing in Detroit out of Eastern Market. But also we have something like 1,500 urban gardens. I mean, there's a huge network of open space reclamation going on in that space. The notion of ecological and productive landscapes has to do with trail and greenway systems, reclamation of large open spaces, reforestation, public lands, a lot of the same sorts of ideas, coupled with trying to create park systems out of these larger bodies of abandoned land, and then also the redesign of basic city systems that will involve sort of how does a city deliver services into a very differently utilized landscape. But the core of it is right in the middle, and that is the 7 employment districts. And that is the sort of going back to build on your strengths concept. These are actually 7 nodes in the city where there is this sort of nation activity, entrepreneurship, small business development, and we have a whole suite of strategies to sort of figure out what it looks like to build this out. So that's still a plan. So we still have this problem with the Shanghai guy right now, right, at that level. So what we've decided, if you go down to the bottom, is that it actually is not the Shanghai guy. It's actually very situational, very contextual. It's what's on the ground, who the players are, and there are sort of glide paths for each of these strategies, identifying who's doing what can we do. But what we have to do, and I think what we will do, and again, we're within probably a month of announcing this, is to announce sort of phase 2 of a community engagement strategy. Because over these last 9 months, what we've done is is really ramped up a very innovative community engagement strategy, not just big meetings with microphones being hogged by people who want to talk about their electrical bill, but actually sort of substantive scenario development, lots of technology interventions, all sorts of really interesting ways of getting people involved. And we really have touched about 40,000 Detroiters that way, and we need to continue that. But then the hard stuff kicks in, which is your question, which is how do you govern this? How do you hold this over time? How do you manage it? What's the implementation strategy? And what's the investment plan? And so I've said that before we unveil this in any shape or form, those last three pieces have to be in place. I think the governance piece will actually be a civic structure that includes the government, but it is not the government. And that what we will do is build sort of a set of constituencies around this work that are already there and just try to figure out how to hold it. That won't work unless we can implement this stuff and manage the strategies, which will be done by the Detroit Economic Growth Corporation. And I think we're going to have to invest heavily in their infrastructure in order to get the kind of project management expertise, the kind of neighborhood development expertise in the game that we need. And for me, in some ways, most important is I think we have to identify our first 150 investments. And we will. We will actually say, given this plan, given where we are, here are 150 things that are already in the pipeline and investable, or that we will invest in. They could be a $5,000 grant to a community garden. They could be a $30 million Richard Barron project to reclaim the creek of eastern Detroit. But it's got to be laid out, otherwise it won't have credibility. And I think we'll get there. And as a result, I think it really does become where all of these other pieces sort of glue together. Because you can't do the entrepreneurship stuff, you can't do the midtown development, you can't do the rail without sort of thinking about the land use parts of this, both the strong beats and the weak beats, because they all sort of interact. So, I'm sorry, I've gone way longer than I thought. But let me just suggest that I think that between the time I was here last, Joel and Ed, and now, each of these 5 domains really has landed. I mean, the entrepreneurship piece, the midtown development, the arts, the land use, and the rail, all have become real. And I think, in a way, it sort of animates that early 9-part drawing, because each of those 9 parts is present actually in all of these 5 ways of working. And I think that this is a very long-term build. It's a very long-term build in terms of the carrying capacity of how you get this done. But also, these investments are going to take a long time to run. I have to show you my last slide because it's probably what you are all feeling right now.
Rick, as you're going through this, so it seems to me that political will is also very important, whether that political will comes from the engagement of the individuals, as well as the investment, but as well as the public. Because as I listen to this, I think really you have become the public sector in this.
That's exactly what I was thinking.
Yeah, and so the challenge is you're butting up against the public sector that's elected. And so what has been your communication and engagement strategy on ongoing?
And this is part of that question. There are 700,000 people who live there. Many of them I've seen have felt empowered, not empowered all their lives. Some of them they felt empowered to do the wrong things or to make mistakes. How do you do this without imposing on them the ultimate indignity, which is deciding for them what is good for them?
Yeah. That's why that little box that has no text under it is actually the sleeper. That continuing community engagement is sort of a misnomer. It is really figuring out community voice. And that is why we've been able to pull this off over the last 9 months than we did before. Before that, we had nothing underneath us. It really was sort of Tony delivering this really complex plan and the city trying to engage its citizens through big town hall meetings that just completely got out of control. They had 3 or 4 of these. They were just disasters. And what this has done is to go out, not just sort of individual by individual, but sort of group by group, interest area by interest area. I mean, we go out and work with the pastors. We go out and work with the small business community. I mean, there are all of these different configurations. And it essentially said on each of these clouds, here's what we're thinking. Here's the underlying data. How would you like to see this play out? And so it's very iterative. I mean, so what's actually in this 800-page plan has all sorts of inputs from the community, and they actually can see it. And so I think in many ways, our biggest supporters are the folks in the community. Whereas a year ago, when the mayor, and again, it's not any more critical of the mayor than I mean to, because I think they tried, they couldn't do it. They didn't know how to do it. They don't do community engagement in Detroit. It's just not what they do. And so, or it's in a certain form. It's these big meetings, but there are very few community organizers in Detroit. There are very few faith-based organizing institutions. I mean, it's quite wild. And so what we've slowly done is to try to build the musculature of community voice. And at some point, it's really hard, as you all know. I mean, it can completely overwhelm you. But you can build support underneath you. And I think that's exactly why the council has actually sort of said, okay, we see that. I mean, you've touched 40 to 50,000 Detroit residents. That's not insignificant. You've been able to mobilize these particular constituencies. That's not insignificant. You've essentially neutralized the mayor. That's not insignificant. So I think you're right. It has to be sort of built on this larger platform over the long term of continuing. I mean, you just have to keep doing it and doing it and doing it.
That's exactly why the next block, the governance structure
Yep.
is so important,
Yep.
because the community engagement feeds right into that civic structure organization, as
Absolutely.
you've decided, which includes the political and the governmental, but also includes the citizen.
Absolutely.
And the interest groups.
Yeah, absolutely well. And there'll probably be, out of this governance board, lots of advisory committees on, I mean, it'll be a big piece of machinery when we're done.
Let's be sure we take questions, and particularly
Yeah,
from students. And I think you said you were a student. No, behind you, two behind. Well, we'll get you.
You're both, but
We'll get you both.
Go.
Okay.
I just want to say thank you for coming. I grew up in Ann Arbor, and
Oh.
my parents and grandparents all grew up in Detroit, so
Interesting.
it's a really issue that's near and dear to my heart. But I was interested in your presentation. I didn't hear really any talk at all about the role of the auto industry.
Mm-hmm.
I'm wondering what has their role been in this, what have they wanted their role to be, and what roles do you think they can play as they get back on their feet? How do you see them as being part of this big plan?
Really interesting question. When we began all of this 4 or 5 years ago, they were completely hunkered down. I mean, they weren't giving. Because they had gotten federal money, they couldn't give any money. They are not particularly community connected. But that is slowly changing. Matter of fact, one of the nice things about the rail project is that when we began, we didn't have any auto money. We couldn't get any auto money in the game. And now each of the big three has contributed major money to it. But at a more profound level, I think, the auto industry has for so long been sort of a monoculture in Detroit, as you know. I mean, one of the reasons they don't have a community organizing tradition is because it was the labor organizers who did it all. And they were always organizing to a purpose. I mean, they weren't organizing sort of generally about community vision. They were organizing for the school contract or new transit contract. And I think one of the challenges is going to be how do they re-engage in a much more diversified, complex place than what they essentially left. And I don't know the answer to that. So for those of you who don't know, Chrysler's out in the burbs. Ford is out in the burbs, but General Motors is sitting right downtown and came within actually about an hour a number of years ago from moving its headquarters out of town into the burbs. So they have committed and recommitted, and what we have found is that their volunteer base is enormously helpful to United Way, to lots of the greening of Detroit, lots of community-based projects. So I think rather than their sort of money driving an agenda, I think they can contribute to this agenda that's being formed. And I think the most important thing they can do is add people power, volunteers. Because as you know, all the suppliers are outside the city limits. And one of the things that violates every tenet of good urbanism that I know is that we've made a decision to start from the inside and not worry about the region for a while. You can't stabilize Southeast Michigan without paying attention to Detroit. which runs counter to everything that Bruce Katz or anyone would ever tell you. You got to work at the region level, right? And I would argue that in Detroit, you can't. You've got to get this stuff in the ground, realizing that all of this is then regionally connected. Jobs, transit, land use, all of that ties into regional systems. But I think that in this first phase, if we can ground the work in Detroit, in the second phase, then you can have a sort of a different kind of conversation with the autos about what's the regional health going to look like as you guys become more stable and more resurgent. But the only other piece I would say is that I think there's a guy named Dan Gilbert I mentioned who runs Quicken Loans. Dan moved Quicken Loans from Livonia into downtown Detroit about 3 years ago. Moved about 3,000 employees. People thought that was great. But we didn't realize that he was going to take all of his suppliers, go visit them individually and say, you have a contract with us. It would be really nice if we could walk across the street and talk to you about it. So in the last 2 years, Dan has bought 10 properties in downtown, big properties, not little properties, big properties, and filled them, 100% occupancy, all with his own suppliers and contractors. And so you now have 6,000 new people on the street in downtown, including Chrysler. Chrysler has never been in downtown Detroit, and they put their ad firm downtown. So I think there may be ways in which the autos can participate more aggressively than they have been.
But you may wait to explore that for a little while. Is that what you're saying?
Well, I think we're talking to them, but I think I'm not sure they're quite ready to sort of fully kind of engage. I think they still feel like they're trying to get back on their feet, and they'll do these they'll move their design firm downtown. General Motors will put $20 million into early childhood education. I mean, they'll do these things that are very helpful. But I think to Joel's point, as we think about governance going forward, there's probably got to be a place for the auto industry and the whole supply chain to be part of this conversation, because that is really the point at which you then start to go regional. You can only get so far just in the city.
But the engineer's mindset is very chunk by chunk.
Yeah.
That's where they play.
Yeah.
Did you have a point here?
Well,
Okay.
I mean, I guess my question is related to, I read Ed Glazer's book, which he's an economist out of Harvard, and he wrote a whole book. It's called Triumph of the City, so it's all about why some cities fail and others succeed. And he kind of tells it as a human capital story, right?
Mm-hmm.
And this, to me, fits perfectly in that. I mean, it seems to me that all the problems are problems that related to that initial flight, like who fled and who stayed, leads to why there's no mid-level, essentially the mid-level managers that become the city leaders in a few years. And I guess I was wondering so I saw one of your areas was education, right? To what extent, how is that fitting in? So some of these, because right now you kind of are the city planners and the community developers. And it's interesting because so many foundations are much more focused on traditional maybe education or something. But it seems to me it's important in the framework, right? How does that fit in, and how are you working with kind of the other foundations who are kind of have those more maybe traditional boxes they like?
That's a really interesting question. So, I mean, I think there are 3 questions there. I mean,
Maybe there are 3
the
questions.
third one is how do you get more traditional philanthropy to play? It's actually been quite hard. Part of the story I didn't tell was, particularly in the New Economy Initiative, the reason I had to do that drawing is it was just awful. I mean, we just couldn't get our wonderful co-investors, all philanthropists, to be strategic and focused. I mean, they were just all over the place because they wanted to fund this, wanted to fund that, because that's what their folks did. And that's true throughout all of this. We had a terrible, I hate to say this, we had a terrible time with Kellogg on this stuff, saying, hello, you guys. I mean, would you please participate? Well, no, we only do kids. We only do food. And I said, we got both of them here. I mean, let's talk. So that's a big. And then there are.
Did they buy the vision and get? I know they got involved in it, but do they understand what you're talking about now?
I think more and more. I think sort of growing on them, but
Who is them?
them.
You're talking
Yeah.
about Kellogg.
What I want to know is who is them.
Yeah.
The real.
Do you have summit meetings, or are you dealing with some staffers I can think about?
Little bit of
Remember,
both.
you're being
A
filmed.
little bit of both. But the real them, I mean, the real challenge, the question, because you have two other parts to it, sorry. The real challenge, I think, is philanthropy is locally based, for whom this way of working sort of evokes more a city of Detroit reaction. That's not what philanthropy should do. You're making us look bad. This is our prerogative. We do economic development. We do the arts. You guys aren't the community foundation. Stop it already, kind of thing. And that actually has been a problem. And so you try to be polite, and you try to say, look, it's an ecology too, like anything else. I mean, you do it. We're not telling you to change what you do, but let's at least be mutually supportive in what we do. I mean, let's not get in each other's way. Let's not throw up roadblocks to each other.
How does the community foundation feel about it?
They're not crazy about it.
Yeah. And
Yeah.
they, again, is big.
I think a little. So that was the third part of the question. But the other two parts of the question are really interesting. Just very quickly. When the Knight Foundation, after Hotting left, came... Pardon me?
It started to do good things. Yeah, go ahead.
And they had newspapers.
They had a newspaper in Detroit, and so they came and they brought their board at night. And Alberto Barguin, who tried to take Hotting's place, came and said, so we think we want to do education policy in Detroit. Is that a good idea? And I said, don't go there. Too hard. You know, for all the reasons you can imagine. It just wasn't ready. I said, you will knock your head against the wall. Rhodes tried it. Gates has tried it in Detroit. You won't crack it. You just won't crack it. And so I think for a long time, for the better part of 4 or 5 years, we set this out. And basically said our best entry point is to do two things. One is to create an educational intermediary that actually has some teeth and can talk about standards, can talk about quality review, can be a funding gatherer, can do lots of good stuff, and invest in early childhood and start to build a pipeline over time, because there's no early childhood system in Detroit. But then, about a year ago, Governor Schneider essentially imposed the General Motors solution on the Detroit public schools. He basically said, I'm going to take 60,000 kids in the Detroit schools, and we're going to divide them into the good asset, it was a horrible thing to say, and he didn't say it this way. This was the GM solution. Good assets and the bad assets. So we'll take the high-performing schools, and those will become the Detroit public schools. There are about 12 of them. And they have good test scores, good teachers, you know, they're all good teachers, but, you know, high-performing schools. And will, ironically, switch the brand. All of a sudden, Detroit public schools, the worst public school system in America, will be known as a really fine school district. Now, the others we're going to put into an emergency, a recovery district. And so we don't stigmatize Detroit, it'll be a statewide district. We'll take the bottom 5% of all schools in the state of Michigan. Unfortunately, the first 15 happen to be in Detroit. So we're going to create an emergency recovery district. And there, all bets are off. We'll innovate until we're blue in the face, and if it doesn't work, we'll close it. And that'll have a separate superintendent. It'll have a separate budget. All work rules are out the door. And because it was an emergency finance situation, they could actually suspend all of the ways that the system was working. At that point, we said, this is our moment. This has to be our moment. And Eli Rowe took me to dinner and said, you know, we've been burned a couple of times in Detroit, but if you'll come in with us, Kellogg will come in with us, I'll get Gates, and we'll get a number of people, and we'll actually capitalize this emergency district. So it's not just a workout district. It's not just a closer district. It's actually a place to innovate. And so they brought in a guy named John Covington from Kansas City, completely new platform, educational platform, no grade progression. It's just achievement progression. It's very techno-based. It's a big bet.
How many kids in it?
This first year will only be 10,000. So it's 15 sites, 10,000 kids. But the expectation is that'll double 2 years and then triple in 3 years. But that's a big lift in 1 year, is to put 10,000 new kids into new systems. So we're to your point, we're taken a big bet against my advice to the Knight Foundation. But I think, these things are so opportunistic. You just have got to grab this stuff. We couldn't have done the entrepreneurship without Susan Beresford's leadership. We couldn't do the rail without Roger Penske's leadership. I mean, you just have to grab it when it presents itself. It may fail, but I think if this fails, then I will again give the Knight Foundation the same advice as well as my own foundation. But we're going to put $3 or $4 million in. Philanthropy is going to put in about 20.
Sweet.
Very exciting and tremendous progress in both your artwork and it's really exciting. One of your pillars is leadership, and it's been discussed here.
Yeah.
And what I want to know is, you often work through surrogates, such as Roger Penske or Covington. But how do you position yourself? Not you personally, but the Kresge Foundation.
Yeah.
How are you? Obviously, you're in the background, as opposed to. So how do you become a background leader? Is really what I.
That's such an interesting question. I can't tell you how many times family members and friends have said, if I have to read another article that doesn't mention Kresge, I'm going to go nuts. I mean, why don't you guys take credit?
Especially your trustees.
Well, that's a mixed, yeah. But so, and I think it's a sort of a delicate balance. I think, there are times when being associated with something successful and powerful is important. It just sort of enhances your own capital to work with, right? Reputational capital. But it also, I think, in the nature of things, puts other people back on their heels, whether it's a community foundation or a mayor's office or something else. And
Who was it that said you can get anything done if you don't care who gets the credit?
well, and when we began with the mayor, essentially that's what I said to him, because he was such a decent man. I said, look, these 9 bodies of work. A previous drawing, and probably the one I showed you last time, actually had an arrow pointing up to the mayor, because I said, "Oh, this can be yours." I mean, just delegate to people who have the capacity to deliver discrete bodies of work the responsibility. Have them come brief you every week. Have weekly press conference. Do whatever you need to do. You pulled it. You're the mayor. You're the one with the public accountability. I completely support that. But interestingly, he just couldn't do it.
Get thee behind me, Satan. You were up there on the mountaintop saying, this can all be yours.
Essentially.
No, I don't think so.
Yeah, well, yeah, I guess that was naive. But I really believed her. I really thought that every single piece of this could, after, and it's been a remarkably short time. I mean, this has all happened in 3 or 4 years. I mean, the mayor could look back and say, under my watch, this is what our community, our civic community has been able to accomplish. I did some of it. Penske did, private sector did some of this. Gilbert did some of this. The riverfront people did some of this. But in the longer term, it's an interesting balance. I'm not sure how to answer that, because I think there is a temptation to want to claim the work, but there's also a recognition, and if anything, these drawings don't do justice to it, is how many people contribute to this. I mean, it's unbelievable how many different inputs there are into every single one of these strategies. I mean, we wouldn't have done the Midtown strategy as effectively if Ben Heck at Living Cities hadn't really had the insight to sort of pull the banks and the foundations together in place. I mean, on and on and on and on and on. So
It's almost impossible to conceive of another kind of institution other than a foundation that could pull this off in a sense. But it has to be an unusual foundation, a self-effacing foundation in order to do it. But you think about, because not only the capacity to deploy money, which a lot of people can deploy, but to deploy intelligently and to be there not to replace or displace the government or to displace any of the other power groups in the city, but to empower them and to facilitate what they do. I can't think of another kind of institution that could do this. For-profit corporations have a very difficult time doing this for lots of reasons, but foundations don't if they're led well, and if they don't require getting the credit for this.
But as you guys probably know, I mean, there's a whole body of literature, Joel Mel, Chandra, and all those guys, basically saying, you don't belong in this space, you guys. Get out of here. I mean, it's your accountability, and I just think, although there is some truth to that,
They're wrong. It's just as simple as that. They're wrong. There are plenty of good examples, not of something of this level of ambitiousness, but there are plenty of good examples of foundations. You mentioned LISC. Well, LISC was a creation of the Ford Foundation and Mike Spiridov. It's in 70-some cities in the country. It's one of the largest creators of community development, housing, jobs, everything. And it's by anybody's measure a success. And there are a lot of other examples of that. So, I mean, the fact that they say the foundation shouldn't be in this, absolutely wrong with that, and disproven by the record.
For all of us who are no longer in the game, is that a growing chorus, or is that just one more of the fad choruses of the moment?
I don't think it's a growing chorus. I think, my sense is that there are people there who question the legitimacy of foundations doing this kind of thing, because but to the extent that you don't want to take, to the extent that you that you facilitate cooperation by people who do have legitimacy, and to the extent that you don't try to claim the credit for yourself and play high and mighty, you can do it. And I would say only foundations can do it for all practical purposes. It's very hard to conceive of institutions that can do it.
One question I got to ask before we go away from here. Nobody ever said, mighty white of you, boy.
Oh, yeah.
I was going to say, come on, let's deal with this one. I mean,
Yeah.
You're a white institution in a black city, okay?
Yeah. No, and I think that was part of the early resistance, not so much of the mayor, who I think really does believe that he has to govern in a broad way. But I think there is such a tradition of black leadership in the political structures of Detroit since Coleman Young, that I think the people around the mayor are very sensitive to this. And so we were on talk radio a lot, local talk radio, in the early stages of particularly of this project, saying, who is Kresge? They're based out in Detroit. They have no connection to community. And my response in the early stages was, that is somewhat deserved. I mean, we need to earn back the credibility of really being about community. And I said, but so watch what we do, please. We will do it with as much sensitivity as we possibly can. We will do it with as transparently as we possibly can do. We'll tell you exactly what we're going to do and how we're going to do it, where our money goes and where our activities go. And then let's have the conversation a year from now or 2 years from now. And in the meantime, we will try to construct a method of soliciting and truly engaging the community in this work. And in the rail project, we've had an enormous sort of community engagement process around the stops, in each of the neighborhoods around the stops. Same thing in the small business development. So it's a lot of, I think we've just, rather than sort of get defensive about it, just say, we get it, we understand. But at the end of the day, we're trying to do good work, and you'll have to be the judge of that.
Let's have another, Joel, can I?
Yeah, sure.
All right. Anyone else before we come back at you? Yes?
I'm also a Michigan native, so.
Oh, that's scary.
Really? Yeah. My question is very broad, but maybe just one example of how you can sort of measure the performance of these initiatives?
Yeah, you sound like my board.
Sorry.
No, it's right. So I think the milestones are very different. So on the rail project, the fact that we actually are going to get New Start's certification, $25 million, it's very processy. Ultimately, we have to measure, does a rail project actually supply the kind of connective tissue that leads to long-term economic growth and development? Do you actually build tax space around the stops? All that stuff. So I think we're going to have some sort of interim measurement that will be largely process-based. Can we put together the investment plan for the land use? Can you get a governance process? I mean, it seems very processy, but in a place without process and without structure and without sort of enduring infrastructure, I think getting that those sort of metrics in place is going to be really important. Then you can measure, are the 7 employment districts actually changing the way people invest in Detroit? And I think as you go one by one by one, you sort of start with the process accomplishments. Are you building the kind of infrastructure? And then that sort of hands off to, all right, what's your ultimate objective? In the education space, a little bit different. Can you get kids to come to these schools? Do these schools perform at a better than average rate? Are their graduation rates going up, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera?
You need to process these things because you are an operating foundation for the next few years. So.
Yeah. And but maybe to your point, we can't be forever. I mean, I view this as scaffolding. We're trying to build the scaffolding, and at some point, other systems have got to come in. And we've seen this with Gilbert. I mean, 2 years ago, who would have thought that this guy would come into downtown and create this unbelievable technology corridor in the middle of sort of a little mini Silicon Valley in the middle of Detroit? But he's really getting huge traction. Who could have guessed?
We'll do one more question, and I'll do a sort of a wrap-up comment. Oh, Suzanne.
I have 2 questions.
You could go first.
Oh, did I miss somebody? I'm sorry. I don't want to be nepotistic here, so I have to. We'll have 2 more questions. Jane, did you have a question?
Oh.
Susan?
How do you keep your board engaged? It seems to me that a lot of boards want to go in and out, and they want to see quick results. That's one question. The other one is, I'm curious to know where people are living.
You mean, are they moving downtown?
Yeah. Where do these people who hang out in that corridor, where do they live?
The board was a big challenge early on. They read newspapers, and they couldn't imagine, investing this kind of time and money in Detroit. And one of the ways we were able to help them is to say, look, Detroit is only 20% of our giving. That's a big number. But it's only 20% of our giving. 80% of our giving is to health and County or environmental work in the Gulf or whatever it is. And that helped sort of keep it in proportion. But I can't tell you how many times we got the question, what's your endpoint? How many dollars do you have to invest before you're done here? And I think that was just a very difficult question to know the answer to. This is such complex, ongoing, additive work. I just can't answer that question for you. And they were very uncomfortable with that for the longest time because they just thought, well, this is forever, and why can't we invest in somewhere easy like Newark? And so
that's the point. That you did it because you were in Detroit.
Yes.
And that would just be self-defeating because that wouldn't solve the same. The notion was that every major foundation in every major city focuses on that city to some degree.
Eventually.
No, well, eventually. Sometimes it takes longer, sometimes it doesn't. But the fact is they do. The question is, how do you do it intelligently? And some of them do it a lot better than others. And this strikes me as one of the best examples of how you really do it right.
So the second question is where people live. Gilbert's play has meant that a lot of people are down in that little circle. The problem, ironically, has been in the Midtown area that demand is now exceeding supply for the first time. So even at the same time that Detroit's population was reducing by 25% over the last decade, the Midtown population grew by 10%. Now it's a small base, but it's growing. And with this live incentive that I mentioned, as well as these young people moving in, they want to live kind of in the core. And there are a number of other pockets in the Mexican town area.
What's the racial portion in that 10%?
What's the ratio of that?
I know what the racial proportion is for Detroit. What is it in your newly revitalized area?
I think we're finding that it's probably half and half. Half people of color, half.
Stunning.
Right. Yeah. Well, remember, a lot of folks have been hoping to come back to Detroit. I mean, a lot of folks who were raised and born in Detroit could find no reason to be there are now coming back. Of the neighborhood revitalization fellows that I mentioned earlier, of the 30, 10 are Detroiters themselves. 10 are people who lived in Detroit and have come back. So 2/3 have Detroit connection. So I think I think what's hard then is that if you go back to that drawing, it's really hard to get people to figure out a strategy. I can't do it up there, but in the East and in the West, it's very hard to right now figure out what it looks like to sort of rebuild that residential density. And I think we basically are saying that's probably not the play we need to make. That for a while, you've got to build the residential density along the core. That's why we're building transit. That's why we're building shops. That's why we're... And it's not just gentrification. These are a lot of small, minority African-American run businesses down here. These are all Hispanic. It's one of the lost sort of great stories of Detroit. Very interesting sort of Hispanic small business culture there. And you just have got to figure out at first how do you repopulate there, create the kind of density that reintroduces markets. If you reintroduce markets, then you sort of all of a sudden Eastern market becomes more attractive. And there's a great warehouse district. It's kind of like the room. Fabulous sort of old warehouses here that I have no doubt will be filled in the next 5 years, but they haven't been touched yet. So we'll get there. It's just, you got to build it up.
Next, last.
Yeah, well, then we can have a conversation offline, but I'm a new president of a community foundation.
Yeah.
Happens to be here. We put about $15 million into this community every year. And one of the things the board and the expectation for the next 5 or 6 years where I'm there is alignment of resources to have some impact in the community. And that's a challenge for every community foundation in America. You've got donor-advised funds wanting to give things here and there. From the first time I ever saw these pictures that you've drawn, it strikes me as you've created a tool for people to see a high-altitude perspective of what's happening in the community, and you view and create an ecosystem model for the way people can visualize how investments and return on investment and activity in the community affects other places. So what I'm wondering is whether there are any plans to use this strategy and to lift it up and to help other people use. You're very self-effacing about your ability to draw and all that, but conceptually what you're doing is very, very powerful, it seems to me, and could have great utility. I'm just thinking very selfishly for myself as donor-advised funds who have $6, $8, $11 million funds. I want to get them to align with the data-driven need of the community. I want them, we have precious little discretionary grant making to make within the community, but I'd like to see, alignment. And we all want impact, and the board wants it too. So what advice would you have, not just for me, but for place-based philanthropy writ large across America, to use these kinds of visualization strategies to help align investment for greater community impact?
It's a really interesting question. Can I back in with a couple of stories, which I think, I'm not sure they answer the question, but I think they suggest that you may be right. One is that I've probably been asked by 15 boards of philanthropies in the Detroit area to come and present that drawing. And I keep thinking, it's a cartoon, but they find it's like a Rorschach test. They find themselves in this drawing, or they don't, and they say, "Well, I don't find myself in this drawing. What does that mean? Can we talk about it?" And it becomes, I think, actually a very helpful tool to kind of generate the kind of conversation you've described. The other example was we brought our board to Washington D.C. last year, met with a bunch of people, but Sean Donovan, the Secretary of Housing, came in, and Sean had come in to Detroit a number of years ago, and he had basically asked the question of the philanthropic community, where can we invest? And it was one of the precipitating events for me to make this drawing, and so I knew it was coming, I drew this, I handed it to him when he came, and then last June when he came to talk to our board, at the end of the presentation, he pulled out of his briefcase this drawing, and he said, you need to understand, and I'm sorry, I don't mean this in a self-promoting way, but he said, you need to understand that Detroit is perplexing to the president and to the cabinet. It's very difficult to talk about where our intervention points are. And we actually use this drawing in a cabinet meeting to try to ground our policy in Detroit. And I kind of turned red, and he said, no, he said, there actually is something. He said, if that were a 40-page PowerPoint, I couldn't do it.
No,
You know, I just couldn't do it. He said, but I can point here and say, you know, this is what LaHood's doing, or here's what Rockwell Landisman's doing, and here's
It's
what
not reductionist, though, is the point. I mean, but how do you make it interactive? And when you go into a boardroom and do that, because
that's interesting.
arts investors who want to put their hand on the arts,
Yeah.
you know, you've got lots of lines that show, well, here's if you invest in the arts, you can also invest in civic infrastructure because the arts can touch those things. You know, could this be made interactive so that if you put your hand on something, you can see what else lights up in the community? You do that intuitively, I think, when you make the presentation, but it's what I go to because it's what investors need to be able to see, and donors and funders in philanthropy who have specific constraints to what they can give to.
Which was kind of my question too, right?
Fair enough.
Yeah, well, what I used to do, because this is all the drawing I had, was I'd say, well, all right, so take this drawing and turn it this way, and then create workflows, a work plan out of each one. Because that's essentially what we've done with Kresge. And so this is a little bit self-serving from Kresge's perspective, because we're in every one of those 9 modules. And so I can actually, I think, describe for you what are we doing in the green economy, what are the touchdown points. But actually,
Can I just say that in the term of art that we tend to use, people could look at that as an early theory of change.
Of course.
And you can begin to tease out pieces from that.
no, all I was going to say is that that's new for this, for today. That I used that. So these are all new for today. And so what? Yeah, I thought, well, maybe there is something in sort of mapping out each of these strands, not all 9, but sort of these ways of working strands, that maybe would be a little bit more conducive to a tool. It's interesting. I hadn't thought about that. But it is an effect. I have found that it's an effective conversational starter with boards who want to sort of figure out how to focus. What do you focus on?
Mark, I think when we meet, I've got a few suggestions.
Good,
It
thank
might be
you.
helpful, and you can be helpful too.
Yeah.
It's about time to wrap up. I think, Joe, do you have a?
I was going to say, the problem that you raised is one that many other community foundation presidents have had over the years. Some of them have dealt with them, I think, not as anywhere near as imaginatively as Rip has, but the issue is to get local community fund holders and fund advisors to understand the problems of the city. The paradigm example of that is the Greater Kansas City Community Foundation, which really did that. They get 95% of their money is in donor advised funds, and so they knew that they had to do something like that if they were going to get people to do something in the community. And if you haven't spoken to those people, you should talk to them because what was the name of the president?
Kathy Richard.
She is now, but the one who actually developed that. But any of that, but there are other foundations that have tried to do that. What they've lacked, and even in Kansas City, strikes me as they never really had the kind of interactive overview powered by a strategy that shows the way in which all of these things interact with one another and how you can do that. This is the only one I've ever seen quite like this, and it just and that's what they've lacked. But they've been trying to do it without that visualization. But it can be done, and as Rip has proven.
Well, in the attention span of most funders, you to capture this complexity, you have to have some sort of powerful visualization tool, and this is the best one I've ever seen. So,
I would love to see
somehow allowing it to be used in a way in other places.
Any suggestions you would have?
Rick, you have a career when this one
Yeah, you do have a career.
I help out if you make pictures. You have a career.
Oh, I
All right, let me just wrap up.
Double it down.
Because they do this kind of thing, but they don't really have a sense. They don't do it this way.
Well, we have to close, and I really want to thank Rip. I have one thought that might be of some value in addition to all the great conversation. You know, we know each other too well. I'm struck by the scaling issues here. How you start at something that may seem tangential, or may in itself be huge, like tech investing, or like the marketplace, or anything else, or certainly the light rail. And each of them seems to be enormous. And somebody would say, oh man, that's scale. And yet, there seems to me to be some kind of organic piecing together since we last talked. And maybe I'm really wrong. Where it's now the connective tissue that's coming into place that wasn't there, was almost there a couple, 3 years ago.
Yep.
And as I looked through this development process, there would be funders at every level who would say, just give me the tech, or just give me the waterway, or just give me that's enough, and the educational system. And somehow or other, it's grown to fill in the pieces. My sense of it, I hope it's your sense, or else I'm destroying everything you talked about. But also, one of the things I hear Rip say is how it's time to stop. Let's not go to the region. Let's not try to push it too far. And so it seems to me enormously wise to do how you've done it. Not that you could have said how much is this going to cost 3 years ago. You still don't know what it's going to cost. But you have had enough restraints placed on yourself, by yourself, to envision this. It is really a theory of change being put into action. And for the folks in my class, a few of you are here, this is a stunning statement about how an involved or an uninvolved foundation can become involved and how much hard work it takes. But it's really a remarkable piece of work, so thank you for coming. This is just the best. 2 years from now, we want to come back and have another. Well, we should go there. That's enough. Our next session is going to be